Okay.
We'll be chatting.
Yeah.
Understand? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Envisioning South Africa's Next Chapter webinar series. This is part 3 of 4 parts, and the last part will be just after the elections. And so I'd like to welcome you here. My name is Patrick Lonwabo Kulati. I'm the CEO of GGA, Good Governance Africa, with a vision of an Africa where citizens are empowered, where governments are effective and businesses thrive, and poverty is addressed and eradicated. And I'm so happy that you joined us today. Sorry we're a bit late. There are a bit of gremlins, but we are here now. We are ready to start. And I'm so happy that you could join us, those of you who are online now and those of you who will be watching this a bit later. We're really appreciative of your time. And I'd like to encourage you to submit your comments. We heard your cry about the comments. We are going to definitely be reading your comments as much as possible so that we can take into consideration your views as well. I'd also like to appreciate our partner, the Mail and Guardian, who have made it possible for us to do this webinar with you in terms of its publicizing it and partnering with us in pulling this off. As I said earlier on, this is the third of 4 webinars that we are embarking upon right up until after the elections of the 29th of May 2004, which is next week. Am I right? So we're just around the corner, and then we'll have the last one when we will basically just wrap up and review and reflect on the elections that would have taken place. Now, for this webinar, I've got a group of high-powered and young, professionals here with me that are that are doing a lot of great work. 3 of them are from GGA, and as you can see, I'm surrounded by brains here, and we are joined by another brain as well. I'm going to give you a bit more detail about them just now. On my left right here is Busisi Po Siobi, we call her Busi. She is the head of Natural Governance Program here at GGA. And Busi has an honors and an MPhil in Public Policy and Administration from UCT. Welcome, Busi.
Thank you, Patrick.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
All right. Welcome. I'm so happy that you could make it today. I was running around trying to check if she was here and Mabato and so on. So I'm glad that they're here. And next to her is Mabato. Or Mabato, yeah. Mungai. She is a data analyst here at GGA. She's also a PhD candidate at the University of Witwatersrand. She holds a BA in International Relations and Industrial Psychology. She's got a number of interests like political economy, migration, democracy, and so on. She does lecturing now and then and teaching at university. Mabato is very passionate about plowing back to high school learners in the area of Krugersdorp. And I'm so happy that you could join us. How are you doing today?
Good.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Yeah. Call it baritone voice. TV voice. Thank you. And then I'll finish up with you, Pranesh. Let me start with the ladies first. All right. On my left, on the third from my left, is Asafika Mpago. She is the communications coordinator for Southern Africa at the Afro Barometer, great organization that we're doing a lot of work with. Asafika specializes in policy influencing, particularly sharing research findings through non-academic communications, such as press releases and so on. We need that because a lot of the information that we receive is sometimes so dense and academic. Now and then we need to be that information to be shared in different ways, like in evidence briefs, infographics, data visuals, television, and other platforms that she uses. Asafika holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Cape Town, as well as master's degrees, not one, master's degrees from Peking and the Peking University, as well as the London School of Economics, and a number of certificates from University of Oxford and Bridgewater State University, respectively. Such a mouthful here. Welcome, Asafika.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you could hear.
You
could come and be here today. Next to him, and the last but not least, is Pranesh Desai. Pranesh is our senior data analyst Within good governance, we have a program we call Governance Insights and Analytics, and he's leading in that program here at GGA. His research interests include African governance, quantitative social analysis, and political geography. Big words. He has an honors degree in international relations, as well as a master's degree in e-science from Wits University. Good to have you, Pranish. How are you?
Thanks, Patrick. It's great to be with you, fellow panelists, and all the listeners and viewers.
That's wonderful. I'm feeling youthful today, surrounded by young people who are leaders in their own right, highly qualified, highly impactful, and really making a huge difference in the country and in the continent. I mean that definitely. Welcome to you all. And I'd like us to get started now so that people can really get to know a bit more about yourselves. Tell us about yourselves, whatever you want to share with the people, but also about the work that you're doing. And I'm also interested to find out at some point, where were you and what were you doing on the 27th of April, 1994?
Oh, goodness.
Let's start with you, Musi.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah.
I am Musi COB. I run our natural resource governance program here at GGA. As Patrick had mentioned, my academic background is in public policy and administration, and my research focused on the corporate social responsibility within the mining industry of South Africa. And essentially, the thesis was aimed to assessing how CSR initiatives are able to benefit mining affected communities.
Okay.
As we had seen through the research, it was not the case. Post my master's, I then interned at the South African Institute of International Affairs under the Konrad Adenauer Stifting Foundation. And prior to joining GGA, I was with a risk management consultancy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, looking at the work that I do within the Natural Resource Governance Program, we essentially aim to improve transparency and accountability within the extractives industry.
Okay.
And we do this through the environmental, social governance lens, also known as ESG.
Mm-hmm.
And how those issues that have been historically overlooked within the mining industry are now being taken more seriously and increasingly becoming more important in not just benefiting local communities, but also ensuring that the environment as well is kept and protected in the process. As we know, GGA aims to improve governance performance within the continent, and why this ties in with our program is because in order to improve our governance performance, you also require to have transparency and accountability mechanisms that will enable that governance performance to be improved.
Okay.
And just very quickly, some of the work that we are working on at the moment, a research project that was quite important, looking at some of the offshore oil and gas exploration projects and unpacking why local communities were unhappy in the way that the offshore exploration project had started. We essentially tried to understand and unpack some of the consultation issues that were brought in to the project, and actually made our way to the Eastern Cape to interview the people that were affected and also be able to raise awareness around the project in itself.
Wow.
Thank you.
It's quite a lot of important work there. I mean, if you think about natural resources, they are the basis of the economy of the country. And what better way can you distribute that? Because up to this point, many people have not benefited from that bountiful. But thank you so much for that background. Let's come to you, Mabato.
Yeah, hi Patrick, and hi to all the viewers. So yeah, like you mentioned, Mabato Mungai, I consider myself to be a thinker, a researcher. right now, as you mentioned, I work as a data analyst, part of the governance and insights analytics team, which is data-driven research, pretty much just using data to try and understand, make sense of what's happening in Africa from a democratic governance perspective, with the most recent major flagship project being the GPI, and that being the Governance Performance Index. Prior to joining GGA, I worked as a lecturer at Wits University for 6 years. Hence, I say a thinker. I won't say I take pride, but I enjoy, or I'm intrigued by how society works, be it from an individual level, continental, macro level, just trying to better understand how society works, specifically from a democratic perspective, from a governance perspective, and what has worked, what can history tell us about the present, what can the present tell us about the future. That's where my thinking kind of orientates itself. And I would say, that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, wow. Thank you so much, Mabato, for that brief background there. There's a lot as well that you're doing. By the way, we're writing an article with Mabato. I'm looking forward to learning more about that for the next couple of weeks. Let's come to you, Asafika. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Patrick. And hello to everyone at home. As has been said, my name is Asafika Mpako, born in Umtata in the Eastern Cape. Was raised there and then later moved to Kokstad to complete high school. And afterwards, I moved on to UCT, as you mentioned, and then later decided that I wanted to spread my wings and study abroad. And so I then went on to study in China and in the UK. Right now, I work for Afrobarometer as the communications coordinator for Southern Africa. So Afrobarometer is a pan-African non-partisan survey research organization that provides reliable data on African experiences and evaluations of democracy, governance, and quality of life. The organization has been in existence since 1999, so for 25 years this year. And we have conducted surveys in up to 42 countries across the continent to date. So we're really leading the charge to bridge the continent's data gap. And our goal is simple, and that is to make citizen voice a key pillar of policy and decision-making on the continent. My role in particular is multifaceted, but I primarily take responsibility for managing a portfolio of countries in Southern Africa in matters relating to the effective communication and dissemination of survey findings, turning complex data, as you said, into accessible, clear, and compelling insights to inform policymaking. So it's really a broad area of responsibility that incorporates multiple things, including research, multi-country partner engagement, content marketing, brand positioning, digital communications, and media relations.
Sure. There's a lot in there.
There is.
There's a lot in there.
Quite a lot.
But thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Patrick.
Pranish, tell us a bit about yourself.
So I'll start with your question about where I was on 27 April.
Yes, please.
I was not in existence. My parents hadn't even met either.
Wow.
And so I came about 2.5 years
later
after that.
They didn't answer that question.
We can circle back. I can circle back.
And I'm about to give a good indication of the sort of work we do in our program.
Yeah.
In the context specifically of where we are as South Africa right now and as a continent as well, some of the most interesting questions relate to what Busi, Mabato, and Asafika have already raised, which is how do citizens hold governments accountable for what they are meant to do? And in turn, how can governments better deliver on what they are meant to do? That's really a core focus of what we're trying to do at GGA. But it's also, a core focus of what we'll be looking to do in the future. One of the things that I'm sure we will talk about is the idea that citizens, including ourselves, I'm sure, should be more involved in the governance process.
Yes.
Not only on election day on May 29 or whenever various people vote in what is being called around the world the year of elections, but also what do you do after that? I think that's been a real animating force, not only in terms of what I'm trying to concentrate in terms of my work and in the program's work, but also more broadly, it's a more fundamental question that I think any citizen should be asking of themselves consistently.
Okay. Viewers at home, I think you can hear that we really have a very highly qualified and a very influential and insightful panel here. And I'd like us to now move a bit deeper into this subject that we're going to be talking about today, which is really about South Africa's youth envisioning a post-election future. That's what we're doing today from a youth perspective. All right. We talked about 1994. What comes to your mind? What does 1994 mean to you? If you want, you can answer the question I'd asked as well. Let's start with you, Mabato.
1994.
We're going to have a conversation. People can chip in,
I was a couple of months old. So that's where I was.
Okay.
1994.
All right.
What do I envision when I think of 1994? The beginning and the end.
Beginning and the end.
Yes.
That's interesting.
And I think the beginning, what comes to mind is a white paper, no reference point on what should be done, but only hope of what should be done. Yeah, long and short, that's what comes to mind when I think of 1994.
Okay.
I enjoy that, Mabato.
Yeah.
I do. 1994, April. I was also a couple of months. Yeah, just under a year, just over a year, actually. And what I envision for South Africa, or in the time of our independence and gaining our democracy, I think for me, it was important to, and it's still important to keep in mind the sacrifices that were made by those that came before us. People died for us to even be sitting like this, to be sharing these views on 30 years of democracy. And it also meant opportunities in the form of just accessing basic services and services around our health, our education, the quality education we've all been offered here as a result of our history and the sacrifices that were made. And then just lastly, I think 1994 symbolizes, similar to what Mabato says, the beginning and the end, to be able to not just envision what social equity means, but also to actually realize it, at least in our lifetime as the youth.
Okay. Asafika, any thoughts from your side? And you can chip in as well.
Wow. That question really forces us to reflect.
That's the idea.
Big question. On the 27th of April, 1994, I was exactly 4 days old. So I had no idea what was going on.
Wow.
But when I listen to the stories that my mother tells and that my grandparents tell, my grandparents are exactly 81 now, and they talk about just the huge sense of hope, as you said, just a feeling, a euphoria in the air, an energy that really, as they say, it was, you had to be there. You had to be there to know what that feeling was like. And I imagine that it must have been something really phenomenal, given the tough history that South Africa had to contend with. And even just months leading up to that election, there was a whole lot of violence going on in the country. And so it was really a momentous occasion, I imagine. And so for me, 1994 symbolizes the freedom for us as young people to dream. I'm a big dreamer. I'm a big dreamer. I'm unapologetically ambitious.
Yeah.
And I really see it as an opportunity that opened up for young people in this country, for Black people who had no access to opportunity, to really lift the lid off of or lift the ceiling of what they had, off of their own limitations, right? The limitations
like
that had
you
been
could
imposed.
You could do anything that you wanted to do.
That you can do anything, you can be anything that you want to be. And so that's what that moment symbolizes for me.
Okay. Have you had any thoughts or discussions maybe with people that were there, even though you were not there yet?
Yeah, I have. To an extent, but I think the two of us have also spoken about it a bit. But crucially, I think what it represents is that change can actually happen. And it's not only because some famous people who are in the history books were involved, but it's also because millions of South Africans and millions of people around the world were involved in that process. And so that's the really important lesson, I think, from a personal level.
Yes.
That as many problems as there are in the world, or in a country like South Africa, or even in a city like Johannesburg, there are actually ways to get involved and to make some sort of difference that can improve people's lives. And then,
I like the phrase that you use, things can change.
Yes.
I think we're going to have to cycle back to that as we have the conversation, but carry on.
And then, in a moment when you are heading to an election, or even what happens after the election, it also highlights that you do have agency.
Yes.
And what you choose to do with that. So, these are really important lessons that I think emerge from that moment. And hopefully South Africans, especially of our generation, keep applying those lessons into the future. Because that's the sort of thing that can actually make a difference to, resolve the poverty or the inequality or the crime or whatever it is.
Yeah. All right. We're going to come back to these issues, but I think you've raised quite an important point. It's always good to hear what people think about what happened when they were not here, but which had a huge impact on their lives, or which not when they were not here, but they were not able to process what was happening properly. I was there. I worked at the IEC station. Okay. As a four-year graduate school student. So it was exciting. I'll tell you some other day. Now, I just want us to move to the topic of the day. Asafika, last week, GGA and the Finnish embassy had an event, and I heard you making a presentation there about the findings of the survey that you had done as Afrobarometer, on a number of issues pertaining to young people, democracy, corruption, and elections, and so on. Please just briefly set the scene for us about some of the key findings that are relevant for this conversation, and then I'll ask the other colleagues to chip in from that.
Thanks, Patrick. So as I mentioned earlier, we work across the African continent. Yeah. And South Africa is under my jurisdiction as the comms coordinator for Southern Africa. And in late 2022, between November and December, we conducted a survey, our latest round 9 survey in South Africa. Yeah. And I should just start off by giving you a lay of the land, so to speak. So what are the priority areas for young people in South Africa? What we found in our survey is that for young people in South Africa, unemployment tops the list of concerns, right? So over half of young South Africans, that's 54%, cite unemployment as one of their top 3 priorities for government's urgent attention. We also found that on average, young people are more educated than their elders. So they are more likely to have a secondary or post-secondary education. But despite those qualifications, they are also more likely to be unemployed and looking for a job. So hence the concern around the high unemployment figures, particularly for young people. Second on the list of priorities for young people is crime and security, which I'm sure is not very surprising to us who live in this country, right? Third on the list is electricity. And I should note that in our last survey in 2021, electricity did not feature in the top 5 of most important problems at all.
So it just shot up.
It just shot up, exactly, to occupy 3rd place now in our latest survey in 2022. In 4th place, we have corruption. And in 5th place, we have water supply, which, much like electricity, didn't feature in the top 5 in our last survey in 2021. Right? So that's what we find, is that young people are concerned particularly about these top 5 areas, and they indicate that government is not performing very well in this area. So only about 1 in 10 young South Africans say that government is doing a good job of creating jobs, of reducing crime, of providing electricity, and reducing corruption. Only on water supply do young people tend to give a more favorable rating of their government's performance. But generally, young people are crying out for solutions to these problems, and they are indicating that government is just not doing enough to solve for these problems. And as a result, we find that in the area of satisfaction with democracy, young South Africans, much like their elders, are not very satisfied with the functioning of democracy. And so that's where we sit. And also, young South Africans, much like their elders, again, say that corruption increased in the year preceding the survey. So I must note that this is a perception, right? Perception of whether corruption has increased or not. But these issues have been highlighted very strongly in our survey.
Okay. That's a good sort of lay of the land about some of the issues that young people are grappling with. But one of the things, I'm going to come to you, colleagues, anyone can chip in, but one of the things that you mentioned last week, if I heard correctly, was the fact that because of this deficiency in the governance system, people are prepared to to live under, I can say, an autocracy or something like that. In other words, if there could be an unelected government coming in, as long as they're going to be dealing with the safety issues, all the service delivery issues, people are fine with that.
So we do ask that question in our survey. We ask our respondents whether they would be willing to forego this democracy and elections if they were to get an authoritarian leader, but one that could deliver jobs, housing, and a safe environment. And we have found, we've been tracking this for over a decade, and we found that over the years, more and more South Africans, including young people, are saying that they would be willing to live under such a regime if that leader could deliver a safe environment, so reduce crime, deliver jobs, and housing.
Wow. I'm going to come to you now, but I'm just reminded of the comment from Jim Powell, which came in online. And by the way, those of you who are watching this either at home or wherever you are, please feel free to write your comments. We're going to read them. Jim Powell says, we, the voters, decide who gets employed as a politician by voting. We, in paying tax, even if it's VAT, pay the salaries of the politicians. That describes voters as the employers. But then he says, our system is effectively a 5-year dictatorship. The legitimate shareholders of South Africa, our province and our local government, and so on. And then he says, introduce direct democracy to control politicians. All right. So let's just respond to what Asafika had just said. Anyone who wants to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to go.
You're happy to go? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Asafika, for sharing such insights. And I think we all, to some level, are aware of these issues. And of course, youth unemployment sitting right on top. I think we have or sit in a very fortunate position to be here employed with the education that we have and the basic services that we have. But I am certain at least one of us, all of us here actually know of someone who sits in that position where they are unemployed, who has the education, who is a graduate, but unfortunately does not have the same opportunities and access that we've been able to been afforded and be fortunate to have. And on that point, I think, and also just touching back on Jim's point around a 5-year dictatorship, I think it's important to center why we are here and why we still need to continue fighting for this democracy. Upon your reflections on the youth now saying, give me an authoritarian leadership as long as these, services and rights are given. So with that in mind, I think it's important then to, in us protecting and fighting for this democracy, is also to, through the electoral system and process, make sure that our governments are held accountable, and make sure that what the youth is concerned about is prioritized, and as Asafika said, is on top of their agenda list and priorities that need to be realized.
Wow. Pranesh, any thoughts from your side?
Thanks, Patrick, Asafika, and Pussy. So, what clearly the data that Asafika has elaborated on highlights for the government, for policymakers, for NGOs, is that there's a clear red light that's flashing about the state of South African democracy. It's especially concerning that young people are thinking at the very least that they might consider alternatives because, young people are ultimately the future on which a system needs to be built.
Yeah.
They are the future majority, whether it's in politics or in the economy or whatever it is. And if they're unhappy with the present system, then that's a clear sign that not necessarily the system needs to change, but it does need to address their problems much more. One of the really useful things to, elaborate on why Afrobarometer is really a valuable tool is that it also allows you to put South Africa in greater context relative to its peers. So on the dissatisfaction with democracy, I think that in about 2011, 2012, when Afrobarometer asked that question, there were around 60% of South Africans in the survey who said they were satisfied. In their most recent published Round 9 survey, which I think tracked data in 2022, it was 25%. The only countries which have had a bigger drop in that period are Botswana and Mauritius, I think.
Okay.
And that's a clear warning sign that not only is it in absolute terms a real warning sign for the South African government and people who can have influence on this. But it's also a warning sign in the context of you doing it much faster than the rest of the continent in this dropping. And so perhaps your response needs to be
Faster.
more quick than it is elsewhere in the continent. In terms of Jim's comments and what Pussy said, the present South African electoral system does allow for directly accountable ward councils at the local level.
Okay.
But we don't have that sort of system at the provincial and the national level. And there is potential scope to introduce these changes in the next parliamentary cycle. And so what I would really encourage citizens to be involved there is that when there are things like parliamentary debates or parliamentary open hearings about this sort of topic, make your voice heard in those forums. They already exist. You already have constituency MPs in some way. You might not elect them, but those offices do exist and they are legally mandated to
listen
MPs
to people's
are
voices.
legally mandated to appear in those forums. And so, citizens can use these mechanisms that already exist to lobby for these greater accountability mechanisms. And that might be, certainly in a personal sense, I think it is one thing that might resuscitate South Africans' confidence in their democracy.
Great points there, Matt.
So several things come to mind. First, I think that it's important to make a distinction between the rejection of a political system versus the rejection of government. So almost to say, okay, in interrogating dissatisfaction, are South Africans dissatisfied with how the government is performing or lack thereof, or is it democracy that they are rejecting? And in trying to, and in making a distinction between the two, the question then becomes, how exactly do citizens understand democracy? I'm going to go back to what I mentioned about what I think about when I think of 1994. And I mentioned like a blank page. And on that blank page in a South African context was democracy, and this new dawn will be accompanied by economic well-being, socioeconomic well-being. And as such, the presence of socioeconomic well-being is therefore became synonymous with the presence of democracy. The absence of it then became anonymous to, if it's not there, it means that democracy is not working. So that also kind of forces us to interrogate our understanding and maybe more specifically, our relationship with democracy, which is like a whole nother conversation. But I think that with the points, the different points that were mentioned in terms of the key issues that the youth has highlighted, I would arguably and maybe dare to say that I'm pretty sure, okay, right now it has increased over the years. But 10 years ago, the youth or the group that was classified as the youth 10 years ago, I'm pretty sure unemployment was still a key issue. Perhaps not water, electricity, but what that means is that over time and over the decades, we have not actually thought of long-term sustainable and creative solutions to some of these challenges. So to say that 10 years from now, when we no longer classified as, the youth and the next youth comes in, will they still identify the same issues as pressing
now? Talking about that, as we'd heard, these webinars that we're having, sort of their genesis comes from scenarios that we did in 2002. Even then, 2002, the issue of jobless growth was a big issue under Thabo Mbeki. So what you're saying is correct, that this has been an issue. At that time, the economy was growing, but for a few people, but the rest was not. But now, I just want to talk about the issue, given the fact that we have this background that you've just painted now. What is your assessment of youth activism? Because when we talk about youth activism, citizens' engagement and things like that, particularly by the young people often talk about 1976 and 1986 and so on. Today, what is your assessment of youth activism in South Africa? Is it there? Is it happening? Are the young people apathetic?
I'll go for it. So my analysis of it would be that, and like you mentioned, 1976 is commonly used as the reference point as what youth activism is and what it looks like. And
because of the protests and the marches and everything like that.
The vigor and just this willingness to kind of die to self for a greater cause. But what I have found is that with each group that is considered to be youth, there's always negative connotations with each generation of young people. We're having a conversation about, I think this week or last week, to say that our generation was referred to as the lazy generation. Not so long ago in February, we had the election workshop here at GGA. And one of the young ladies, individuals who participated said, why is this 2024 election considered the youth election, and all of this responsibility of go out and vote?
On young
prior
people.
to this moment, all I've heard is that I'm part of a lazy generation. And now I've been tasked with this big mandate, not to answer the question as to, is the youth apathetic? No.
Okay.
And we've seen this with certain movements, whether it be Feast Must Fall, Rose Must Fall, the calls for decolonization of education and universities. How it looks like differs. And that's the part where, just because it's not always maybe in your face, we now have different tools, be it social media, be it through, now that we, compared to our parents and previous generations, we've got quote unquote access to certain spaces. So the question now becomes, what does activism that's not on the street looks like? What does activism as an academic look like? What does activism as a lawyer look like? It takes different shapes and forms, but long and short, I would say that the youth is not apathetic.
Okay.
They are active, but in different tones.
ways.
You talked about this as well. Yeah.
Yes, I
That's
did.
your take.
Yes, I do believe, as Mabato, that the youth are not apathetic. I think that it's a very simplistic argument.
Okay.
And dare I say lazy, to simply say that youth are apathetic.
Yeah.
What our data has shown, for instance, critics like to say that youth voter turnout is very low.
Yeah.
Youth aren't voting as much as their elders. And in our surveys, we've observed that self-reported voting of the youth is lower than their elders. That we observe in our data.
Yeah.
But what's important to note is that declining voter turnout is a phenomenon that we observe across age groups in South Africa.
Okay.
So that is something that is happening across the board. More and more South Africans are showing up less and less to the polls, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing to note is that young people are engaging in non-electoral forms of participation at similar rates to their elders. So for instance, in the area of like contacting traditional leaders, we found that young people contact their traditional leaders at similar rates to their elders. They contact political party officials at similar rates to their elders, and they also participate in demonstrations or protest marches at similar rates to their elders. So youth are engaging in non-electoral forms of participation as much as their elders. So to just simply write us off as being apathetic or non-participative is simply lazy or simplistic in my view. And as Mabato has noted, there are new forms of engagement that young people are picking up. And we've seen how young people have used social media as a tool for activism and awareness raising. And that has been an important form of engagement. And also we need to think about whether youth participation depends on whether youth believe that they will be heard. Because in our survey, we also ask about the efficacy of elections, whether respondents think that elections actually produce the kind of results that they want. So do elections ensure that voters' views are represented in parliament? And most South Africans, which includes the youth demographic, don't believe that elections work well to ensure that their views are heard at the highest level. And so perhaps youth are turning to forms of engagement that elevate their voices.
Okay. I think we've answered this question. Maybe you may share some thoughts, but maybe let me just sort of transition a little bit to you as I give over to you, Busi, to say you guys are doing great work here at GGA and Afrobarometer. You're doing great work. In other words, it's also a form of activism. What you're doing on good governance, on writing, on engaging, and so on. Tell us a bit more about how that makes you feel as a contributor. What do you feel like you're contributing towards, or are you feeling like the work that you're doing is contributing towards making a bigger change? Because you see, we also need to understand that it's not going to be every young person on the streets. Others are going to be conducting research, are going to be doing public policy work, which is what you're doing. How do you feel about that space? Do you feel like that there is space for young people to make meaningful contribution? You conduct research and all of that. Are you being listened to by those in power?
Thank you, Patrick. I think your big question. There's definitely space for young people to make meaningful contribution. I think here as researchers in the area of influencing policy, on advocating for good governance, on strengthening our democratic institutions, on putting forward transparency and accountability mechanisms that can actually put our leaders into account. I think when you then sort of look at it from a personal level and professional level, at that is firstly our contribution by purely being represented as Black women here, first of all, is in itself a form of activism and showing that we are part of a growing inclusive government. So that would be the first one, through representation, knowing that if I'm conducting research in the Eastern Cape within a mining affected community, there's that reliability that the person can relate to, one, in understanding why their voices need to be raised and awareness created around them, but most importantly, that we can, through the research that we do, be able to advocate for good governance on the continent and specifically South Africa.
Thank you. Pranish?
Thanks, Patrick. So I definitely agree with Pussy that there is this overlap which exists between societal problems and what you also as a researcher choose to focus on.
Yeah.
So for instance, in my specific case and in the case of the program that Mabata and I are in, one of the key areas of focus for us in recent years has been coalition governance.
Yeah.
And that's quite clearly an issue at both the societal level, but also personally as a resident, you get affected by, if there's dysfunction at your council because political parties in South Africa aren't figuring out this thing quite, as effectively as they should.
I'm sure the Joburg residents here can attest to that.
Yeah. And so, that is one area that I've personally worked on quite a lot over the past 3 years. But it is also interesting to see the way in which I have worked on it. So, for example, I've given many media interviews and engaged with policymakers on it, but I haven't actually spoken to my ward councillor about the issue. And, that also highlights that there are these other mechanisms in which maybe you could play more of a role in influencing things more directly. Yeah. Because ultimately, the ward councillor is directly accountable to me in one way. Yeah. And, despite having spoken about coalitions a lot in other spaces, and hopefully that will make some impact among the many voices that I am a part of there. Are there other ways in which you can, on a personal level, try to lobby for greater change? Because those mechanisms exist in a way that they didn't 30 years ago. Yeah. Not only because South Africa is now a democracy that's non-racial, whereas previously it was not. Yeah. But also through things like social media, all these various different avenues of getting in contact with people. Yeah. And it's important for citizens to continue to use that, but especially young citizens, whatever they decide about the system they want, it is important that they keep holding these people accountable, because one day they might find themselves in these decision-making positions, and hopefully they then expect the same thing of young people then, that they'd hold them accountable. And that's the sort of cycle we want to see develop in Africa and in South Africa as well.
That's great. I mean, it's been amazing to see the role of social media in holding people that do bad things to account. How people, and you find your name just trending and in companies, and so it's been amazing. But Pranish, just before I move, I want to just speak for a few seconds on the work that your team and Mabato's team are doing on the GPI. Just tell people about the GPI. Why is it important? What is it? And what does it tell us about? What is its contribution to young people, for example, or its potential? Yeah.
Sure. So the GPI, or the Governance Performance Index, is an evaluation of the state of local governance in South Africa. Yeah. So basically, our team looks at a range of indicators, spanning various areas with its administration or service delivery or whatever it is. Yeah. Using publicly available data to assess the state of all of South Africa's 257 municipalities. Yes. What can young people do with that sort of information? Well, one, in a similar way to the way in which Afrobarometer data puts things in greater context.
Yeah.
What this does is it puts your municipality in greater context.
Okay.
Every municipality has areas to improve on, but what are some of the key ones which your specific municipality can get more involved in improving.
Okay.
So that's one of the key things that GPI does. What it also aims to do is, and we've been engaging a bit with national and provincial governments on this, is identifying areas where intervention might be most needed. So in this respect, it could be intervention in the context of financial administration. One municipality is really bad, and that's not a problem just because corruption is a problem in and of itself.
Yeah.
Corruption also means that there's less money to actually spend on important areas, like ensuring that households in a certain part of the Eastern Cape that was historically really deprived might have more access to these sorts of goods and services that many people in cities are taking for granted.
Yeah.
How do you ensure that the quality of your water is adequate enough that you can actually drink it? These are the sorts of things that
without killing you.
Yeah, has a practical impact on people's lives.
Yeah.
So that's some of the work we're trying to do there. We're also trying to expand that initiative in at least some way across the region more broadly, so that citizens across Southern Africa can start finding out more about how their areas relate to the rest of the continent and the region, but also how they can get more involved in that process.
All right.
And hold those officials accountable.
I appreciate that, because I think people can benefit a lot from reading our latest governance performance index on our website, which is www.gga.org.za. Yeah. So please go out there and engage with us on that. You were talking about corruption, and there's someone here, I don't know whether it's Kwelani, but they say that young South Africans, much like their elders, I think it's quoting from what you're saying, are dissatisfied with the current state of democracy and pervasive corruption. And then this is the question. As youth, how can we actively contribute to addressing and reducing corruption? Additionally, what practical steps can we take to improve service delivery in our communities? How can we make a difference after making our mark on the ballot box? That's the first one. I just want you to leave it hanging in the air so that you can absorb it, and then because I'm gonna come to you when Asafikile for the answer to that, and then Kwelani says, considering the limited resources and structural issues in the country, the challenges highlighted require full participation by external stakeholders. We need leaders with good understanding of social cohesion. I think this is a comment. Also, you may feel free to comment. There's also a comment from one of our previous guests, Bafedile Bopape. She says, what ways can we use to hold the political leadership accountable? All right, I'll start with you and then open it up to all of you guys. Any one of these questions, just go for it.
I think we can all agree that corruption is a significant problem in this country at all levels of governance.
Yeah.
And it's important for young and old to hold their leaders accountable. And so there are many ways in which you can do that. One is coming up next week, an opportunity for us to go to the polls and vote for a party that best represents our interests and the South Africa that we want to see. So that's one way, is voting. But also, there are multiple other ways outside of elections that we can hold leaders to account. And I think that we don't emphasize these enough. We expect to go to the polls every 5 years to make change happen, as Pranesh said, but we can make change happen in between those periods as well. So, for instance, as Afrobarometer, we ask respondents about how often they engage their ward councillor, how often they engage their members of parliament, how often they engage religious leaders, how often they engage political party officials. and also how often they engage in protest marches or demonstrations, and how often they engage in community meetings. Because as we know, there are community meetings taking place at the local level to discuss issues around service delivery and how these can be addressed. And many of us don't often attend these meetings or participate very actively in them. And so we need to expand the ways in which we engage in this democratic project, and expand the way in which we engage with our leaders at all levels, because we have many leaders who are leading in our communities. It's not just the leaders who are leading at the national level. We have to hold people accountable at all levels, because corruption is happening all across the board.
Mabat?
Yeah, I was actually to thoughts right out. I was going to say we need to reimagine what public participation engagement actually means and looks like. And like Asafika pointed out, democracy happens in between the 5 years. The day of the election is literally, how I picture it, is turning a new page. But the real work happens in between the democratic process. And because sometimes the task at hand seems so grand and seems so overwhelming, you can kind of think, what does my contribution actually mean? Almost like voting. If I don't vote, it won't make us significant, but you're part of one that makes up 1 million, and that million makes up a huge number. So I would say to maximize on existing platforms, South Africa, like many other African countries, comes from a political and social fabric whereby, we like to use the word Ubuntu. Communication was the way to go. When you go to townships, everybody's roaming around. The next door neighbor knows the next door neighbor knows the next door neighbor. Everybody knows each other. So from that platform and avenue, and as such, we have not maximized on this this fabric, this cultural fabric of communication. So, and as such, we now see this huge gap between citizens and the government, whereby you see maybe around the election cycle, political leaders are more present and so forth. There's a study by Salga, 2015 study, that shows that citizens who have had some form of contact with a local councillor or ward leader are either less likely to actually engage in violent protests, or are more likely to feel satisfied because they've had some form of communication. Right now, there are various town hall meetings that are taking place. That should not stop when elections are done. How do we keep that momentum going? And beyond hearing what the people are saying, actually thinking about what the prescribed challenges, recommendations, how can it be put into effect? How can we, quote unquote, Pranesh, you're going to probably give me a look at this, but decentralized participation and access to our political leaders. How can we make sure, like in the USA, they've got this 100 days of measuring, how the president is doing. Even from the provincial level, 100 days to measure, or 60 days, or 6 months to measure performance. And if they're not performing, how can we make sure that they are held to account, that there's some form of, consequence management? I feel like that would also make citizens feel like they are heard. But I echo what Asafika said in terms of engaging in local meetings, and as an individual, taking agency and asking yourself, what am I doing to contribute towards this democratic process?
I'm going to give you now, I do want us just to spend a bit more time on this issue of the question that was asked was, what, as youth, how can we actively contribute to addressing and reducing corruption? And also, if I may add to that, we're talking about participation, but participation can have costs. It could cost transport, it could cost time, it could cost. So how do people who have nothing, how are they able to pay that cost to participate in a democracy? Maybe it's a question that I'm going to leave. Did you want to say something? Did I see your hand up?
So in response to this question, I think that firstly, you need to understand how deep the scale of the problem is. So, for example, the last time that it was announced how many municipalities are currently under investigation for corruption, I think it was around 123 out of 257.
Sure.
So nearly half.
Sure.
So that
That's
tells
bad.
you that it's really widespread problem just at the local level, let alone provincial or national, or a lot of private sector corruption, which does exist. Once you know the scale of the problem, then you move towards how do we identify different forms of corruption.
Yeah.
And there, some of it is blatant, like if a police officer wants a bribe to make sure that, you're not going to be punished for whatever, even if you've committed some sort of minor infringement or not. Or it could be something much bigger, involving, a rigged tender process or whatever it is. So understanding that there are these different types. And then thirdly, it is by engaging with your fellow citizens to make sure that these problems are pointed out, because there's, a collective voice is usually much stronger than one voice.
Yeah.
But also what it also importantly means is that even if one person can't make a specific meeting because of transportation costs or whatever, if enough of them can make these sorts of meetings, then enough of a message can be sent. The problems around transportation costs and these sorts of things can only really be dealt with if we get an economy that is growing more and more, that allows for a greater social safety net, that means that people can have more affordable transportation, A, but B, also being more able to pay for this transportation access because they have jobs or some sort of form of
They have some sort of income. Yeah.
So that really highlights also the scale of the challenge, because there's no easy question to how can someone who has no food on the table tonight participate in a community meeting?
Yeah.
Because they can't.
Even if it's put online, they probably wouldn't have the data or Wi-Fi to be able to do that. I wanted to segue towards the issue of because you a big chunk of your research and your work is in the area of mining and so on, which is the private sector or business. Now I want to segue to the role of business in this issue of youth empowerment, because we've spoken about the problems that young people are facing, and then we transitioned to talking about the issue of youth participation and the issues that we've dealt with there. Now, I want us to transition slightly to the issue of how youth can be empowered. And now, in the case, what can businesses do really to empower young people to participate meaningfully in the economy, in just the improvement of life? Any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Patrick. I think the business community has a huge role to play in this regard in empowering the youth. One of the ways in which it can be done is through public-private partnerships that already exist, right? So, for instance, you look at the mining sector, and specifically within their corporate social responsibility programs, initiatives that aim to improve the performance within schools, whether it's building them in training teachers, right to building clinics and hospitals. So being able to, as a business operating in whatever environment and context, seeing yourself as a development partner, because the youth that is within that community is the one that you will likely depend on in some way or another to be part of that workforce. So being able to strengthen the existing PPPs, which will then inevitably assist in empowering the youth. And I think usually in the mining space specifically, you'll find that the focus primarily is within looking for STEM graduates, and people within the social sciences are left out. And I think one of the ways in which, with the mining industry now, and how they can also promote youth empowerment in that space is being involved within civil society organizations that are able and are dedicated to push and promote youth empowerment. So I think public-private partnerships is one of the ways in which big businesses can continue to invest in the youth and make sure that they are empowered in the process.
Okay, thank you. Public partnerships. Any other idea?
So I think Bus is focused on it a lot in the context of what businesses can positively do.
Yeah.
I think there's the other aspect of it, which is how can they deter negative actions. So private corruption is a big thing in South Africa and globally, and generally businesses are, and understandably so, relatively conservative about how they call out other aspects of private corruption.
Yeah.
But it is important, if they recognize that corruption is a societal problem, that they do get involved in that calling out process. Because that's how you deter other private actors from being involved in corruption. And, preventing that from seeping into the public sector as well.
Yeah.
Because, it can be something as simple as a rigged contract, or it can be something more pernicious like, buying off cabinet posts or whatever it is. They need to call it out when it happens and when they're aware that it happens. Whether through a whistleblowing process or something more public.
Yeah.
Because that's the way in which you actually can cause a deterrence effect. And ultimately, the important thing is that even if it might hurt you slightly in the short term, over the long term, if that corruption is exposed, that will have an even bigger impact on your reputation if you weren't a part of addressing that problem. Because they'll, the public or consumers or whoever your target market is will pick up on that, and they might turn away from you as a result.
Sure.
I think if I could add, another challenge to big business is to review their existing CSI strategies. If I think in the area of education, there are businesses, for instance, that give scholarships to students to study in the fields that Lucy has mentioned. And yes, oftentimes there are social science students who are left out. So that kind of thinking, to think more broadly about who we want to fund and what society we're trying to build, but also to look at the criteria that is used to assess students' performance, because we know that our education system faces a number of challenges, and we know that students oftentimes, by no fault of their own, don't score as highly as they would like to in their exams. But what happens if you put the criteria too high? Say if you say you must have an A for the subject,
or a
then what happens? Yes, or a distinction. What happens is that you produce a particular kind of you replicate the same kind of systems that include certain people and exclude others. And so we just exist in this vicious cycle where there are people who are excluded and exist on the margins of this society, and who have not had a quality education and are unable to find employment, and so on and so forth.
So their entry point will forever be blocked by the criteria that are expected for you to come in.
Exactly. And I think big business needs to take more of an initiative in saying, okay, if we're going to accept a cohort of 100 students, how can we actively participate in upskilling them as well, given the society that we exist in?
Okay, I'm going to come to you now, Mabatu, but let me just read here, because I want people at home or wherever they're watching to feel like they're part of this. And it's very important. I really appreciate the commentary that is coming through. Bafedile is coming back. I'm reading your book, by the way, Bafedile. It's a great book. She says, I am actually impressed by the way these youth responded to the question of youth being non-participative. I have always felt that youth of today are just not interested in what is going on. Clearly, you've explained that. And then there's a question from Tembi Nell. Thank you so much, Tembi, regarding the ESG. I think you were talking about it earlier on. ESG and beneficiation. Big words. Lots of work is done in the Eastern Cape province, from what I heard. Have you ever thought reaching out to the Northern Cape province, which holds the bulk of minerals, and extracting?
The short answer is no, we haven't. And I want to contextualize why the Eastern Cape was a focus area for our program. It was around the offshore oil and gas exploration that raised governance questions on if the people, the communities were properly consulted in the process in which the exploration license was
so the people
permitted.
was it the
In
Kolobeni?
Kolobeni, yes. So the Wild Coast region.
Yeah.
And this was around 2021, where there was massive protest action from environmental groups, excuse me, human rights groups, that took traction even globally on this particular issue. Again, bringing up legacy issues that we felt compelled as GGA and also as the program to look specifically on some of the environmental questions and social questions and governance questions that were brought by these communities in saying we're not part of this process at all. We were not consulted. And on top of that, the regulatory frameworks that are essentially administering how mining projects are done and how mining rights and exploration licenses are given. So at the core of it, it was primarily pushed by this particular exploration project. That's why we had focused on the Eastern Cape region.
Okay. It's not an intentional exclusion of others.
Exclusion, no.
Yeah, I think, I'd like us now to sort of move towards the end of our conversation by looking at this upcoming election, because this is for us as GGA, this is part of our election program in terms of not just raising awareness for people and encouraging people to vote, but to also tease out some of the issues. Now, I'm coming to you, but I nearly said Bafedid. Mabato. In February this year, the Daily Maverick newspaper reported a huge turnout by young people in their final voter registration that was done by the IEC. And then in that article, Simon Mabolo, who's the IEC Chief Electoral Officer, was quoted as saying, there has been an important reversal of the historic underrepresentation of young person. In other words, there's more people, young people that have registered to vote. That sort of was a good signal from their perspective. And what do you think are the drivers of this? Having said that, but also we understand that registration is one thing, then they're still voting. What is it? What could affect this huge number of young people that are registered from actually participating? And what are the drivers of this shift? Is it a matter of a huge education drive, voter education? What do you have a thought in terms of what could be the drivers of this?
Okay, so for the first part of the question, in terms of what is the driver for the huge voter registration, I think that there is a sense of urgency and recognition that some form of change is needed. And as I'm saying this, what also comes to mind is that I think it's easy to, how can I say, I think if you're part of a particular age group, you have experienced different waves of this democratic process. You've got different reference points of this democratic process. If you're someone who is 25 or your first time voting, 2025, whatever age group that you may be in, but part of the youth group, you don't have as many reference points
around elections.
You don't have, a lot of context as to this is how things was. All you know is what things were. So sometimes what we tend to find with the youth, and in now trying to answer your question, is that perhaps you can hear what of the sacrifices that happened, and then sometimes there's this mistake of assuming that the youth don't know the struggle because everything is kind of given, without failing to recognize that perhaps the struggle looks different. The struggle that the youth is faced with now, perhaps to the older generation, it appears this is privileged problems that you are faced with. Exactly. But still challenges that the present youth. So to answer your question, I think that the large registration turnout is stems from a recognition that something needs to give, that some form of change.
There's the urgency.
Precisely. Now, to answer the latter part in terms of will this translate into actual voter turnout, I think one of the determining factors will be one, I won't say feeling confident, because I think most South Africans, I saw a stat that said about 32% of South Africans don't know who they're going to vote for. Now that 32% is the one that we like trying to urge to go out and
Well,
vote.
they've made the commitment to vote,
Yes.
but they just don't know who to vote for.
Who to vote for. And I think that will be one of the key determining factors, feeling like, okay, I can actually, I have a sense or know who I actually want to vote for. Second is the ability and willingness to imagine, as Pranesh mentioned a bit earlier on, change. That is being able to imagine South Africa post the current context that we are seeing. I think that imagination and ability to dare to imagine will also influence the voter turnout, particularly among the youth.
Part of that imagination, Pranesh, I want to come to you now because both of you are working on this area. Part of that imagination, and in fact, it may even happen according to a lot of pundits, is the issue of possible coalition government that might arise. What is the potential of that in terms of taking the country to the next level? Having had these coalitions at the lower levels, but not necessarily at the national level. We had the first democratic government. It was the coalition between the ANC and the National Party. But then, I now want to talk about these upcoming elections. What, in your view, is going to happen? Or what do you think the implications are going to be?
So, thanks, Patrick. So, firstly, I want to talk about why we are seeing coalitions.
Yeah.
And in essence, it's because they're meant to be forming in South Africa because of how our system is set up. So South Africa's system is set up on the basis of a principle called proportionality.
Yeah.
What that basically means is that if you get roughly 5% of the vote in an election, then you'd expect to get roughly 5% of the seats in parliament or in a municipal council or whatever.
Yeah.
And the reason we have this system is the negotiated transition into democracy. And it was thought that this principle of proportionality would give the most diverse voices a chance of gaining representation in parliament.
Yeah.
So it's quite an important principle, and we have it. And the thing is, in proportionality systems across the world, one of the things that is more common is coalition governments.
Yeah.
So what's happening in South Africa is historically, because the ANC's dominated politics at the national, provincial, and local elections, we've had fewer and fewer coalitions than we'd expect to see in a proportional system normally. What's different now is that clearly the ANC, whatever happens now, is in decline in some way or the other. And so we need to get used to coalitions more and more. Now, whether that happens at the national level in next week, we don't know yet. What I will say is that almost certainly Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal will have some sort of coalitions because, of the way the patterns of voting that we have seen in these areas over the last 10 years or so, it strongly suggests that we will see that.
Yeah.
And if you have Gauteng and KZN under coalitions, that means 44 to 46% of the country is under coalition already, which means you have to deal with it as a governance issue. Already at the local government level, I think there are around 80 councils, so 1/3 of the councils that are coalition governed. So South Africans just need to start getting more and more used to it.
Are we ready for it at the provincial and national level?
I think that clearly political parties and citizens are both struggling to deal with this new reality.
Yeah.
I have confidence that they'll get used to it over time, but there will be teething problems. There always is. One of the very important things, and one thing that I will be talking quite a lot about, and GGA will be talking quite a lot about over the next 3 weeks, is that coalition agreements must be made formal and they must be made public.
Yeah.
So it will help give voters a much better idea of what's happening if political parties work to formalize coalition arrangements as opposed to having a very impromptu, spontaneous sort of system.
Things are just done in the dark.
Yeah.
Because then voters don't know what's actually going on.
Yeah.
And they need to be made publicly available, as
Yeah.
much as political parties might hate the idea of it,
Yeah.
because that gives voters an idea of who to hold accountable if issues start coming up.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the problems at the local level has been that we've had very few formal coalition arrangements and very few public ones. So how can we encourage greater behavior amongst political parties?
Yeah.
Well, as citizens, it means not keeping quiet after election day. It means saying that we understand that you have to deal with this coalitions thing. We have to deal with it as a country.
Yeah.
How can you make yourselves accountable to us beyond election day as well? Because if the governance failures in 2027, what can't then happen is opposition parties or whoever's governing the country or province will say, oh no, we'll wait until 2029 to see what the voters say then.
Yeah.
No, both citizens and politicians in a democracy need to engage with each other beyond election days. And South Africa as a whole needs to move away a bit from that mentality, as Asafika and Mabata and Busi have already indicated.
Yeah. Come in. I want you to be thinking about, because I want us to wrap up with the education part. I'll come to you now, but I want you to describe to the people the voting modalities that are going. There's going to be 3 voting ballots. I just want people to understand that. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Patrick. I just wanted to touch briefly on something we've been working on as Afrobarometer.
Yeah.
So between April and May, we ran a telephonic panel survey. So it's a pre-election survey, but it will also be holding a post-election survey.
Okay.
And we've used a sample of 1,800 South Africans, and we ask them questions around country direction. So in which way do you think the country is going? Is it going the right way? Is it going the wrong way? We've also asked questions around satisfaction with democracy. And we've also asked questions around which party you're likely to vote for. Just to go back to Mabato's earlier point, and just to give a sneak peek, because we'll be releasing these results officially tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Just to give a sneak peek.
You're appetizing.
Yes. We have observed in our data that there's a substantial number of South Africans who indicate that they still do not know, at the time that the survey was concluded, on the 13th of May, they did not know which party they would vote for. So this indicates that in the week leading up to the election still, there is some room for political parties to sway voters' votes. And so I also want to mention that one of the drivers as well for this high youth voter registration could be the entrance of new political parties into the ring. Because yes, we have seen that a number of new parties have formed in recent times, and perhaps young people are seeing themselves represented in these new parties, and perhaps they're saying, this is a party that can represent me, that indicates that they have my interests at heart. And also the entrance of independent candidates is also something that has been an interesting development in our electoral system. So it's going to be an interesting,
it's exciting
time.
Also. It's exciting also, but talking about the because I've had people on the phone, friends, even family members, saying, I'm not sure who to vote for. But I think there's a paper that I recently read or something with this European professor who studies the brains of the people as they go to the voting booth. That many people, not just here, go there without really fully formed views about who they vote, but he has a way of mapping out people's minds and then when they get there, and then on that ballot box, talking about the ballot box, just talk to us about these 3 ballot boxes that we're going to see, because it's something new in our voting system.
Sure. So what basically happened is that now independent candidates are allowed to stand in national and provincial elections.
Yeah.
And there's a history to that, but I won't really get into that.
Yeah.
The practical implications of that as it concerns voting means that whereas in previous national and provincial elections, you only have 2 ballots.
Yeah.
This time around, there'll be 3 ballots. And this is where the explanation might get lost a bit.
Yeah.
So one, there's the provincial ballot,
Okay.
and that will have political party candidates. Usually the face on it will be possibly of the premier candidate, but it will also have new independent candidates who are eligible for representation in provincial legislatures across our 9 provinces.
So it won't have the national figure.
It might.
It might. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you have the 2 ballots which apply to the National Assembly.
Okay.
So Parliament. And those 2 ballots are, because they're 2 ballots, we can tell that they're separate.
Yeah.
And deal with separate seat allocations. So the one is national lists.
Okay.
So national lists, you'll only see political parties there, and usually what you see is the candidate for the president of a party, and there might be some exceptions.
Okay.
Based off recent court rulings or whatever it is. Then there's a second ballot, and this is the confusing one. So it's basically seats that are allocated to each province based on population size, but who gain representation in the National Assembly.
Yeah.
And that's the national allocation of seats where independents are allowed to stand.
Okay.
So basically, it's a third ballot that's been introduced to figure out how we can fairly introduce independence into our electoral system.
Okay.
So, in a nutshell, that's what the 3
That's what
ballot
it's all
system
about.
is.
Okay. All right. We are now wrapping up. Thank you so much for that. But I think this platform is also educational. As we're headed towards election, we want people to vote, but we want people to be informed about how the mechanics of it are going to be. We are a non-party political organization, and so we don't say vote for who or whatever the case may be, but we're saying just vote. As we wrap up, colleagues, I just would like us to say, what are your hopes for this country? What are your hopes for South Africa? What do you think has to change so that young people who are feeling as hopeless as they are around issues of, joblessness, issues of electricity, issues of water, issues that, Asafika was talking about and that we've talked about. What do you think needs to happen for our country to be improved? Few points. Let's start with you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to share Pranesh's sentiment that one, change is possible. And we are living within that time and those changes. I think it's also going to be important to, as South Africans and specifically as the youth, to be involved in these processes, in the electoral system, in how we keep our political leaders into account. Like Asifika had mentioned, the different ways in which you can do it, not just our political leaders, but our traditional leaders, our community leaders. Right through, it's going to be very important because you will be informed and empowered in that way. I think what I also see for South Africa and what is important to center is strengthening our transparency and accountability mechanisms to, one, protect this democracy and what was fought for during the apartheid regime, but most importantly, to realize social equity within this lifetime of ours.
All right. And I'm coming to you now with these closing remarks, but I do want just to read what Putela Mieni said, as well as Sku. It says, do some parents find it awkward to discuss race relations with their children born post-apartheid, such that it creates a detached approach within the youth, although formally acknowledged? I don't know how you understand that, but see if for what it's worth, just maybe if you want to make a comment to Putela, was he's asking about the issue of discussions around race relations in the country. And then school, I suspect that this is our school. I don't know, but school says, powerful, highly pitched interventions from South Africa's youth. You are the hope Africa needs. And then she comes back again. She says, What do you think the land question means for the diversity of South Africa's youth? What would you say are the issues at stake? That's a big issue on its own, school, as we wrap up. But my colleagues are here, and maybe you might want just to, in your closing, just making your remarks, what do you think has to happen in the future of South Africa? This land question is to be part of that tapestry of the future. It has not yet been resolved to the satisfaction of everyone. Perhaps it's another issue that we may have to have a webinar around. Let's come to you.
Okay. I try to touch base on the first question,
Yes.
wrapping up one. The third one,
We'll come back to that, school. It needs 2 hours of its own. Yeah.
But on the first one, I'll speak as a Black person with that experience, I know.
Yeah.
And this is also based off of conversations that I've had with friends and other Black people. Growing up, race is not actually something that was discussed. If you attended a multiracial school, chances are you had white friends, because it's not something. Funny enough, it's only last year that for the first time, and my grandma's like 75 this year, that she spoke about her experience under the apartheid regime, because it's something that she's never ever spoken about. And back then, my grandfather was quite politically active, and their house was one of the watchdogs and raided often. But that is also very telling of untold scars that many generations, especially our grandparents, carry, and our parents being subjected to the parenting that came from that untouched wound. So that's just to answer the first question. My hopes for South Africa, and this is the optimist in me, I'm extremely hopeful for South Africa.
Yes.
Because it's very easy to view South Africa in silo. It's easy to assume that the things that are happening in South Africa are only happening in South Africa. But when you think about the fact that we are only 30 years old, we've just entered into proper adulthood right now. And
we're still crawling babies.
But when you compare what we have accomplished, even in terms of the democratic process right now, how I like to sometimes view it is that we're seeing the ooze and pus of 400 years of colonization, 45 years of apartheid, that cannot be undone in 30 years. But the amount of work and progress that we have done from a governance perspective, from a democratic perspective, not to say that to shy away from the work that needs to be done, but we should indeed pat ourselves on the back for the strides that we have done. Where we are at now, we are saying that it is not enough. We don't want to use things as reference points, but create new reference points for generations to come. We are sitting off of the labor of previous generations. Now our task, and when I talk about right now, I'm going to be inclusive and say, when I speak about now's generation, I mean everyone who's present, living now. Our new task is those who come after us, what can we say we did to make their lives easier? And I think that is like the tension and the tussle that we have now. There's an increased intolerance to the political bad behavior. And now it's a matter of what are we going to do about it? How are we going to do about this? But that will and that irritation is a good sign, and it's an indication that South Africans are not apathetic, but really want change.
Sounds to me as if the idea of people siloed by race or this is gone. We have a country and a future that we need to start working together to improve things. Wrap up from your side. What, I don't know, we want to respond to this, but there's the bigger question that I asked, which is, what are your dreams and hopes for this country?
I think I'll respond to that.
Okay.
Pranesh was right earlier when he said that one of Afrobarometer's strengths is the fact that we can compare ourselves to other countries on the continent, right? And when we compare ourselves in the area of democracy, citizens want for democracy. It has declined over the years. The supply side of democracy is wanting as well, because our government is not delivering what citizens want, right? And I've highlighted what the priority areas are for youth in particular. And as Pranish said, I think that what Afrobarometer's findings highlight is that there is a huge demand for change. There is a demand for government to deliver. And these findings are really sounding the alarm. And they're saying, listen, you need to take action. You need to make sure that those who exist on the periphery of the society start to feel that they have a stake in it, that they want to protect it, that they are invested in building it. And I think that that is the task, right? But I want to end by saying I'm extremely proud of being a South African. I'm extremely proud of young people in this country who get up every morning with immense odds stacked against them, but who are determined to make their lives, the lives of those of whom they love, the lives of those who don't know, but who are fellow countrymen, and they want to make their lives better. All of those people that I've mentioned. So I think that my last message is just a word of encouragement to young people in this country to understand that the arc of history is long and that we're going to need to put in the work. 30 years seems like a long time, but as you rightly said, it's not really a long time in the bigger scheme of things, exactly. And so we need to understand that we are active agents and active participants in building this country, and we need to continue to do that work, because I do believe that young people in this country are doing the work in all corners, at all levels. So I'm really proud, and I encourage young people to continue to do the good work.
Thank you so much for that. Asafika, let's come to you, Pranish, in your closing remarks.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks to everyone for watching and for everyone for participating.
Yes.
So I think one thing that I do want to touch on is that it's important for everyone, at home and more broadly, to remember that young people voting at lower rates or turning out at lower rates or registering at lower rates is a global. There are areas in South Africa that are perhaps more concerning in terms of how much that gap's been increasing, but it's a global thing. And so, really, especially in a year of elections and a time in the world's, history when there are many problems and challenges, but also potential solutions and exciting new innovations. My message is really directed to young people in South Africa and young people more broadly. Just keep learning more about the world in which you find yourselves in. Enjoy it for what it is. Make mistakes because they'll help you down the line. Have successes as well, because those are important for your confidence. And enjoy that process, because it only really does come at one point in time. And so participate in elections if you want to. Participate in community meetings if you want to. But the one thing that people can't take away from you, and unfortunately the world's moved into a place where knowledge and information is more accessible, at least in some respects, than it ever has been. To learn more about the things that you read, question what you read, check if it is factual, and that will make you a more informed citizen, and hopefully it will lead to, if you can inspire more and more people in your generation, and I guess in my generation as well, to be a part of that, then that's also how change can keep happening. And that's a really important thing, not only about being a South African, but being a human more generally. It's a process, and you can be a part of it.
Wow, what a great conversation we've had with young people that are informed, incisive, really powerful in their thought processes, but also a hopeful conversation. We sort of followed the journey of young people, but we're ending on a hopeful note that it is not all lost. There is a lot that we can be hopeful for the country. I traveled recently to Ghana, and the Uber driver that was driving the Uber had lived in South Africa for 8 years. And so we had this chat, but he's from Ghana. He couldn't forget the privileges that young people have, including things like grants. He says you don't ever find that anywhere in the world. You're anywhere in any country, like in Africa. And he was amazed at the privileges that we have here. But we are here, we don't necessarily see that. So the point is that sometimes if you are in something, you just need to step out. You can see a lot of opportunities. But I really want to thank you, all those that have been able to join us from home, from, I don't know, from offices or wherever you are. Thank you so much. We're going to have another webinar, the last one, the week after next, the Tuesday after next. I think the week after the elections, we're going to have that. Please join us again, and please subscribe to GGA platforms. You know, you can check our social media platforms. We want your support, we want your partnerships, whatever issues that you are dealing with, as long as it is under good governance and making this continent shine again, and to make this continent and its people grow and become better. So thank you so much. Enjoy your evening. And thanks to you as well.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Patrick.
You've been a great audience.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.